City Journal podcast. I'm your host, Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and senior editor of City Journal. Joining me today on our panel are Jesse Arm, director of all things politics at the Manhattan Institute and polling. I got that right this time, Jesse. I didn't slip up. John Ketcham, who directs all things cities at the Manhattan Institute, and our special guest today is Rob Henderson, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, prolific Substacker, author of Troubled, a memoir. He's really just all over the place. Thanks, Rob, for joining us on the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Great to be here.
I want to jump right into our news of the day. We're going to tell a little bit of a City Journal podcast. We're going to do a little bit of a New York City focused story. Friend of the show, Zohran Mamdani, the self-professed socialist candidate for mayor who looks likely to take second place in the Democratic primary in a few months, said in an interview recently that he wants to rehab unused retail space in New York City subways to serve as linking hubs, provide services to the homeless. This provoked, I think, more than a little surprise. It's sort of a typical Zohran Mamdani story. I could sort of ask an illustrative question, but in my notes, I just have the word, what? So I'm going to ask that to John. John, what?
Well, Zohran Mamdani is this inexhaustible well of bad ideas, and this is just the latest one. About 30% of New York City subway systems' retail stalls are vacant right now. But it's not something the city controls. This is the MTA. And the MTA is constantly in need of money.
Which is separate from the city, right?
It's separate from the city. The MTA is a state-controlled entity. Now, it's constantly in need of funding, both for its operations and for its capital needs. I have a piece in the print New York Post today talking about a hidden tax that Kathy Hochul in the state legislature adopted to downstate payrolls. You don't see it on your payroll, but employers pay it, and it's going to raise, about $1.4 billion more for the MTA, and it's still $3 billion short of its $68 billion capital plan. So the MTA constantly needs money, and here we have 30% of vacant stalls. I say let's rent them out, even at modest rates, to allow for economic opportunity and to put more eyes on the street, or in this case, in the subway system. The last thing New Yorkers want are more disturbed and homeless people in the subway system. And I think Mamdani's proposal falls way short of where voters are on this one.
Yeah, I wanna sort of get at the politics of this because part of what I find interesting with this race, why I think it's more than a New York story, is that the fight in the Democratic primary for mayor of New York is being, and we've talked about this on the show, is sort of being fought between sort of a left-wing radical and Mamdani, who's getting about 30% of the vote, and former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has sort of painted himself as the moderate, will probably win the primary after Eric Adams dropped out, the current mayor dropped out of the primary, and is winning maybe 50% of the vote. We'll see what the final runoff tally is. But Jesse, I'm curious, do you think that Mamdani thinks this is going to play well? Like, is this a winning issue? What's how do you fit this into the broader political landscape?
Zohran Mamdani is building a powerful, broad-based coalition in this mayoral race. People who think it's good, actually, to have more mentally ill homeless folks sleeping in the subway. Brooklyn socialists clad in Islamist scarves around their faces who enjoy shutting down Grand Central during the evening but never morning commute. And now, following yesterday's all-important endorsement, fans of Ella Emhoff, Kamala Harris's fashion model, Nepo stepbaby with, cartoonish tattoos and proud armpit hair. Her endorsement is particularly surreal given that Mamdani and the Democratic Socialist Alliance, or Democratic Socialists of America, of which he's a part, literally ran the Leave It Blank campaign last year, aimed at encouraging Democratic voters not to vote for Harris over Trump. So I think the bottom line is that Mamdani is consolidating the lunatic lane. The DMV and the subway are already two of the most dysfunctional systems in New York because the government runs them. And Mamdani would like to expand that remit to where you live and where you buy groceries. So No wonder Cuomo is beating his progressive challenger by roughly 30 points. And that said, we could end up with a four-way general election here with Cuomo as the Democrat, Adams, the current mayor, is running as an independent, Curtis Sliwa as the Republican, and Mamdani on the Working Families Party line. And in that scenario, things that seem impossible today, like Mamdani becoming mayor, could suddenly become alarmingly plausible.
Yeah, so Rob, you're a recent transplant to New York City area. Welcome. I'm not. But you've I think written a lot about this sort of cultural phenomenon of the sort of group that Jesse is alluding to. I wonder if I mean, I don't know how read in you are on the Mamdani campaign as a recent arrival, although you can vote as recent arrival in New York City, even if you're not a citizen. I guess
Get
I got
an
rid of that.
idea.
Do you need an ID? John will tell you.
Well, no, not at the point of
Thank
voting,
God.
but
Thank
the
God.
the Court of Appeals actually struck down the non-citizen voting law that the city council had passed and that Adams had allowed to become law without his signature. So it is not legal to vote in local elections as a non-citizen in New York State, thanks to a fairly progressive Court of Appeals as well. So yeah.
Okay, so you can vote, non-citizens can't vote. But anyway, my question is like, what do you make of the durable power of what we would talk about as the Mamdani coalition? Like, who are they? Where do they come from? And why are they? Do they continue to be constituency that would cause somebody to go, I think that what we should do is turn vacant stores in the subway into homeless shelters.
Yeah, well, you're right. As a recent transplant, I'm a reluctant member of the rootless cosmopolitan elite, and so I arrived in New York knowing little about the local politics. So in preparation for this, I read a little about Mamdani, and yeah, he has his father, well-resourced academic with impeccable educational credentials. Mom's a filmmaker. And I read a little about Mamdani's background. He played cricket. He enjoyed moonlighting as a rapper. And I thought that was kind of the ideal for like a modern aspirational elite who, you play cricket, but you also rap. Like those two things, sort of this blend of high and low culture and trying to be cool. And I noticed this guy, well, anyway, like he's representative of what I like to call the luxury belief class. Someone who himself was raised, in abundance and affluence, almost certainly never, had to experience, direct, um, fear, violence, addiction, all these kinds of things that a lot of ordinary New Yorkers face every day when they ride the subway or when they're out in public or when they commute to their jobs. And he has all of these interesting newfangled ideas that win him, points and credit and applause from his voter base and people who grew up in similar circumstances as him. But there's a reason I think why he'll ultimately be unsuccessful. He's also young, probably naive, which may connect to later topics that we'll talk about in this discussion. And the way he carries himself. I read this interview with him in GQ. He says, my style is Uniqlo. He's tries to present himself as an ordinary person with no references to the way that he grew up. And he also wears three rings, and I don't trust any man who wears three pieces of jewelry like that on his fingers. I think a man, you should be limited to one, maybe two rings. You got your wedding ring, you get a ring for maybe tracking your health and fitness. But once you get to three rings, I think that should raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, I think part of what shows up here is and our Leona Zagara wrote about this a while back in the Bigger Apple newsletter, is if you look at the breakdown of mayoral primary polling, basically Cuomo is winning everywhere except among college educated white voters in Brooklyn, and those people are breaking from Mamdani. And that's like, this gets to your luxury beliefs thesis, Rob, which is the like, there's a class who is very happy to say that like we shouldn't do fare enforcement on the buses, and we should let the subways run out of control, and we should have government run grocery stores, another Mamdani original idea, because that's that aligns with sort of like value priorities, and we're not really going to pay the costs associated with all of those things. So to me, so much of this election is about sort of the tension between people who believe that stuff and people who don't believe that stuff and would like the city government to provide basic services. I wonder if you think that framing makes sense? And if so, do you like think the luxury belief class is a durable political constituency?
Yeah, well, government-run grocery stores, that's not quite original to Mamdani. I think that's been tried before. But
Brandon Johnson wanted it
there
too in Chicago.
there's no shortage of socialists who think they can reattempt that experiment and think they'll be successful, perhaps because they're so far removed from, concrete reality and how these policies actually work. Is it the luxury belief class? I define as people who well, these are ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the less fortunate members of society. And the luxury belief class, they're sheltered from the consequences of their beliefs. And is it durable? I mean, it seems to be. May have reached its zenith in 2020 to 2022, and I think a lot of people are now publicly condemning a lot of these ideas, but there will always be a highly educated, progressive, aspirational elite that will attempt to distinguish themselves by, holding unconventional or peculiar or bizarre views, in the name of, presenting themselves as compassionate or interesting or sophisticated, signaling their values, and they seldom pay a cost for when those beliefs actually do proliferate in the culture or get implemented in a policy.
You mentioned the Brandon Johnson and the grocery store idea in Chicago. Uh, if I recall correctly, the city didn't even apply for the state grants necessary to get the idea off the ground. So there's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of performative politics here. But when the rubber meets the road and you really have to perform for government, and it's much more difficult. And those in positions of authority realize that, perhaps too late. But at that point, some of the political wins have been had, and Zohran Mamdani also wants to build 200,000 units of publicly subsidized housing, public housing. I mean, Naisha's track record is absolutely abysmal. It's the worst housing stock in New York City. Naisha is the worst landlord in New York City.
New York City Housing Authority.
Yes, the New York City Housing Authority. Excuse me. And to think that we could do it again and better this time, it beggars belief.
I wanna take us out, so I'm gonna ask everybody, in your professional opinion, what do you expect to be the craziest idea floated by a mayoral candidate this election season? Good or bad? Can be a crazy good idea or a crazy bad idea. John, I'll put you on the spot.
Well, Mamdani's plan to freeze rents. I mean, that is just absolutely bonkers. We already see the consequences of the 2019 rent stabilization law expansion, which have led to things like landlords keeping their units vacant because it's not economical to rehab the units. They can never recoup the costs of that renovation, so they keep them quote unquote warehoused. You have a critical housing shortage, and yet you have thousands of units that are empty right now because of our rent regulations. So freezing rents would just exacerbate the problem way worse. And that is an extremely radical idea. It's never worked and it never will.
I have my own crazy good idea. We send Andrew Cuomo to Uniqlo. He cuts into the Mamdani vote. He looks fresh as hell, and we avoid having a commie cricket player in Gracie Mansion.
I'm fine with this. I will donate to the cause of kitting out Andrew Cuomo and Uniqlo.
And
And
do
have
it before the tariffs kick in.
Here's the question: is can Andrew Cuomo rap? Rob, what's your take? What do you think is
I
the
mean,
craziest
I mean,
idea?
other than what's been discussed, as I mentioned, I read a little about Mamdani before. One of the things he said, this isn't really sort of a policy proposal, but one thing he said was that he wouldn't have sent in the police to the Columbia encampments, which blew my mind because I don't know if he was unfamiliar with what was happening on that campus or if he was familiar and was just perfectly fine with it. But people were being harassed and physically attacked. I mean, obviously, people are familiar with the vandalism and destruction of property. But there was that famous story of the Columbia janitor who was trapped inside a building, and these activists were preventing him from escaping. I mean, they were literally holding a guy hostage, and Mamdani said, "Well, that's perfectly fine. We don't need the police to deal with that." Clearly, his idea of what's acceptable is, I think, different from most people's.
Yeah, I'm gonna take one. I'm gonna take one out of left field, which is I'm gonna go back to my favorite long-standing proposal, which is to dredge the water south of the tip of Manhattan and increase the size of Manhattan substantially, so that you can build more stuff on the island of Manhattan. I feel like Zelnor Myrie or somebody has already embraced this, so I feel like that's already happened. So it can't be the craziest idea, but it's my preferred crazy idea, so I'm gonna go with it.
Something like 20% of Manhattan is reclaimed land, like in that way. So
You can keep it
not
going. We
that
can
great.
get more. You can have greater Manhattan. I'm all for it.
No
All right.
NIMBYs there.
Yeah. All right. I wanna turn a little bit to the national news away from New York City, although we love New York City here on the City Journal podcast. On last week, the Department of Health and Human Services released its comprehensive review of the science of gender transition for youth and adolescents. The review followed a Trump administration executive order, which asked for it. It found little evidence to support the use of medical interventions to address gender dysphoria in children and recommended further research into the topic, including alternatives like comprehensive psychotherapy. So I want to, we talk about this a lot at City Journal, the youth gender medicine debate. To me, the interesting question is this gonna matter? I mean, the report is a 400-page brick. It's, I think fairly comprehensively written. But Jesse, you're sort of the most real politic. Like, is this gonna have an impact on the debate, or is it already too polarized?
Well, the HHS review is a landmark moment, both as a rebuke to activist captured medical institutions and as a vindication of the work of thinkers like our Manhattan Institute colleague, Lior Sapir, whose scholarship is deeply embedded throughout the review. Critics are already shrieking about the anonymity of the authors or the report's proximity to the Trump administration. But these are total distractions. The science is the science, and it mirrors what we saw in the Cass review in the UK. Low certainty evidence, serious risks, and an utter collapse of medical safeguards. So, where this review goes further is in its clarity. It ditches the euphemisms no assigned sex or no gender affirming care and names the ideology for what it is. It shows how American medical associations have become echo chambers for activist subcommittees and framing a complex clinical issue as a human rights crusade. Most importantly, it makes the ethical case that given what we know, pediatric medical transition is not just unsupported, it is indefensible. Uh, the report is not aimed at Twitter warriors or the American Academy of Pediatrics' PR team. It's for the real adults in the room, policymakers, institutional leaders, and physicians who are finally ready to break the silence on this gruesome and ugly practice, which has become all too normalized in the United States.
Yeah, I wonder, get John and Rob's opinions, so feel free to hop in. But I think that there is some sense that there has been a backlash against sort of the excesses of this stuff in the last administration, the excesses of this stuff over the past uh 10 years even, conflicts over trans athletes in sports, conflicts over youth gender medicine. But I wonder to what extent you guys think that can be sort of solidified, whether it's possible to sort of come to a consensus, or I've been thinking a little bit about, and they're obviously not perfectly analogous, but there was this moment in the same-sex marriage debate, the passage of Proposition 8 in California, where it seemed like same-sex marriage was gone for a generation. You fast forward 7 years, and it's the law of the land. So I'm curious about, and again, they're not perfectly analogous situations, and I'm curious of the overall dynamics. Is this an opportunity for consolidation of the sort of more reasonable position, or is this just sort of like a byway along the road to sort of ultimate victory on the part of the sort of more extreme advocates?
Think it is an important consolidation moment because it's bringing the U.S. in closer conformity with the rest of the world and away from the affirmative model. The U.S. and Canada were global outliers in terms of using puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones as the first-line treatments instead of psychotherapy. Countries like the U.K., Finland, Sweden, France, others, these are Western European democracies, they're progressive countries, they've all moved away from the affirmative model. and they've moved instead towards psychotherapy and psychosocial supports. So this report brings us closer into the global consensus, and that's very important. Also, it's going to be used in courts. So right now, judges are apt to defer to the medical establishment, which, as Jesse says, is quite captured. And this will be the HHS report will be used in amicus briefs, for example, to provide an alternative basis of authority to assist judges in their decisions on the appropriate standard of care, which really the evidence shows should not be gender affirming care and over medicalization through puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Yeah, Rob, I wonder if do you have a take on the broader trajectory?
Well, yeah, I think it always helps for people to have a kind of an authoritative document to point to. I mean, in some ways, it's wild that we even need this. I mean, my understanding of that report is that one recommendation is to pivot away from hormonal treatments and surgical operations and more towards psychotherapy approaches to basically help depressed and anxious young adults understand them better and come to terms with their current gender identity, or to explore further whether those other options might be necessary. And this, I've seen critics say, is tantamount to conversion therapy, of simply talking to a mental health professional about their conflicts. The manipulation of language. So this is conversion therapy is surreal. And I also find it just generally interesting, this tacit acceptance that there is a biological basis to sex, because otherwise you wouldn't need surgical treatments or hormonal procedures or anything like that. And simply talking to someone would be enough to affirm someone's gender, but that's clearly not the case. I'm hopeful. I think this is the trans movement in general has been unpopular for a while. Many of you have probably seen the survey data that even among Democrats, there's sort of this growing skepticism of that movement, of whether someone can actually change their biological sex or not. So I think this is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, part of what I think about and again, you can think about marijuana legalization. These are sort of and same-sex marriage, sort of the two big social movements that are pointed to as like, this is an opportunity, this is evidence you can have dramatic social change very rapidly. But when I think about the debate that happened over same-sex marriage, it really came down to a dispute about harm. This is the position I'm sort of talking myself into, which is that but one side said there will be harm to children, the other side said there won't be harm to children, and the latter side sort of won the scientific dispute, with sort of one very conspicuous exception that was vehemently fought over. Uh, and I think it became the sort of American political calculus was just like, is there harm here? Americans like mostly want to be left alone. Whereas in the youth gender medicine debate, it becomes much easier to make an argument at harm, right? It's like we have relatively low quality evidence of benefit, and there's just like a lot of evidence that putting kids on puberty blockers without long term, without any certainty about what the returns are, is like gonna do bad things to their experience in puberty. And so that's like a relatively easy to win argument. So I think there's some benefit here in just sort of laying that out. That said, I wonder, and this is sort of a general question, to what extent do we think this sort of like evidence-based argumentation is gonna be persuasive to the average voter? Is this insulating? I guess I've already sort of asked this, but I think there's a broader question of like, is it given the willingness of the last administration to sort of make up evidence, to what extent do we think sort of picking the fight in this domain will be useful?
The evidence here conforms to common sense, right? And the potential harm here is iatrogenic harm, which means that a medical intervention itself can cause harm and the persistence of the symptoms. Look, kids go through phases. Um, and everyone who has children knows that kids' identities change in the course of their development. So calling one such phase a child's true self has the potential to lock in that as their supposed true identity. Whereas there are decades of studies that show that the majority of children who are not affirmed in their supposed gender identity will come to terms with their biological sex. They will get over their gender dysphoric feelings, and they will not persist in their supposed new identity. And that is probably quite close to the experience of most parents and those who care for children, such as teachers. And so I think there is going to be some stickiness here just because everything is aligning in the same direction in common sense and evidence.
I guess we're in agreement. I will take it. All right, I wanna take us out. Um, let's do. It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But this is being recorded for posterity, so maybe in 5 years people come back and hunt us down. But what's the projection? I think there's a sense that we had this sort of insurmountable march of the spread of youth gender medicine. In 5 years, are our state's going to be more or less restrictive on the availability of gender associated treatments for minors than they are today? Is it going to become less available or more available? Rob, I'll put you on the spot. Dude,
Uh,
what's your projection?
I think probably less available. I think, one reason why this type of document can be helpful is, it can lift, silence, this preference falsification, that people understand that other people out there also disagree, that this is the way to go if your, child has some confusion over, their gender identity, that there are multiple options and there's not just this one that you feel socially pressured to adhere to, of immediately going to the healthcare provider and engaging these sort of irreversible procedures. And I think for a long time, I've heard whispers even among friends on the left that this has gone a little too far. I think one reason why the same-sex marriage thing was successful is because it was about adults, and you mentioned this kind of this harm principle. Once the trans movement started going after children, I think that was when, it started to become doomed. If it was still just adults making their own decisions about their own bodies, and, you could have discussions about restrooms and everything else, but if it's just adults, I think most Americans are pretty sort of libertarian in their attitude about that. But when you start going after children, obviously, battles and conflicts will arise. So I think less over time.
Jesse, what's your projection?
Public opinion and evidence is a hell of a combination. But there's another factor here, which is to say, A, we can pat ourselves on the back, and a number of our other colleagues in similar organizations and public policy think tanks, to say that this is already so much less available, at least in red America, than it was, just a few years ago, thanks to the on-the-ground work of colleagues like Lior, who I mentioned earlier, and Chris Rufo and others. But uh, top down in blue America, I don't think the evidence and public opinion won't be enough to move the needle. You'll have to have somebody who comes to the fore as a major political leader who's able to gain traction in the Democratic Party and speak harsh truths to his own camp and faction. You saw this go on with the Republican Party regarding certain foreign policy realities over the course of 2015. It took someone like Donald Trump to come to the fore to sort of shake the consensus a little bit, because um, you know ironically, in political parties and movements, ideas are rarely questioned unless you have kind of like a breakthrough figure who's really able to reshake the consensus. So yeah, cautiously optimistic that this stuff will be less available in 5 years, but that may be contingent upon a soul-searching kind of truth teller rising to the fore within the Democratic Party's political apparatus, which, on the other hand, I don't have a high degree of confidence in happening.
Fair. John, what's your prediction?
One of the policy areas we have to keep a very close eye on is uh, social transitioning in public schools. And this report, I think, will cut down on that to some extent, but it is a very live issue. I predict it will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Manhattan Institute just filed an amicus brief urging en banc rehearing in the 11th Circuit, a case out of Florida called Little John. Um, so this is happening in red states and blue states alike, where schools and teachers, administrators, they are not revealing the fact that they are calling children by different pronouns and different names to those children's parents. So they're keeping it a secret, and we believe that it violates parents' fundamental rights to direct the upbringing care of their children. And so we could see that becoming a real ground of contestation going up to the Supreme Court because it's happening in multiple circuit courts of appeals.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, to me, the interesting question is, is this sort of the Prop 8 moment, or is this the sort of moment of failure? The other analogy is the euthanasia / assisted suicide debate in the late 90s and early 2000s, where there was sort of a spread to a couple of states, and then it never really took off. Although John has a great forthcoming piece in CJ about attempts to pass assisted suicide in New York. So they continue to try on this front, but it's never really grabbed onto the electorate. And I think there's a real open question about, why did that attempt at social change, using many of the same metaphors, not succeed where same-sex marriage did? Yeah, I'm sort of with everyone else in being like cautiously optimistic that this is not that this is going to be a milestone, but I think John is also right that you want to be careful. It's you certainly can't. It's not over till it's over. Who's to say? It's Yogi Berra. Uh, on that note, so Rob, our special guest, has a great new piece out in the most recent issue of the magazine, which, by the way, I encourage all of our listeners to subscribe to. They can read Rod's writing, they can read everyone's writing. It's a great magazine. But that piece actually just went live on the web yesterday, on Sunday. And it's about the foolhardy insistence on listening to the youths. So I'm gonna ask everybody inspired by that to share a story of why you shouldn't have been listened to as a kid. Jesse, I'll put you on the spot because you seem like you might have gotten into some trouble as a kid. You didn't write a
Um,
memoir about it, but
yeah, you guys should read Rob's book if you think
fair.
I got up to some trouble as a kid. But okay, so this story actually went viral yesterday. So I wasn't one of the kids in the Barstool Sports Bar in Philly ordering bottle service with a sign that said "fuck the Jews." But I hope I can say that on the City
That's
Journal
okay. It's okay.
podcast.
It's
Uh,
close.
but but I was a Jewish college kid who made the mistake of listening to the kind of polite center-left bureaucrats in the anti-Semitism industrial complex, the ADL types, who always offer the worst possible advice. And Dave Portnoy, the head of Barstool Sports, the media company that owns this bar where this incident happened, for a moment fell into the same trap. His initial instinct, reflected in an amazing and classic Portnoy style social media rant to go scorched earth on the anti Semites, was exactly right. But after talking to some of those same milquetoast, squishy Jewish institutional voices, he pivoted to the world's most tired cliche, sending the offenders on a Holocaust education trip to Auschwitz. Now, I never brandished anti Semitic signs as a kid for obvious reasons, but I did learn early that the worst thing you can do is take your cues from these failed professional anti Semitism combaters. And Portnoy, at nearly 50, is learning the same thing now. Part of what's made him such a cultural force, more than just a guy with a sports blog, is that he's an original thinker. He doesn't blindly follow elite consensus or outsource his instincts to consultants. And in this case, his instincts were dead on. If your gut tells you to crush the Jew haters, trust it. And let's be honest, the idea of sending them to the Holocaust Museum to learn has become kind of a punchline in and of itself. It calls to mind one of the comedian Modi's best bits about how if someone insults any other minority group, they get canceled immediately. But if they go after Jews, we just hand them a museum ticket and hope for the best. So, as Modi jokes, they don't leave remorseful, they leave impressed. They want a souvenir hat. Yeah, Muhammad Adnan Khan from Temple University is not going to hate Jews or the Jewish state any less after Portnoy pays for his travel to Poland. We have decades of proof that you can't educate the Jew hate out of people. Better to have them fear us than beg for their love. Trust your own instincts, crush your enemies, and make no apologies for what you are and what you stand for.
Okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. I'd run that in CJ. John, I assume you've been a 50-year-old man since you were born. But can you tell us any exciting stories from the youth of John Ketcham?
My kindergarten teacher said that I was an old soul, so yeah, I've had this lane for a long time. But as I was reading Rob's piece, it really reminded me that the cult of youth in America, and in the West broadly, but in America, I think it's most pronounced. It goes back to Rousseau, right? The idea that human beings are born good and that they get corrupted by society, right? That is the paradigm of the noble savage. That's wildly implausible, right? That is not a model to base a viable political philosophy on. The Judeo-Christian tradition gets it right, and the science that Rob mentions, I think, supports it. Look, human beings are wounded creatures. We have a capacity to do wrong, and our social, our legal structures have to reflect that imperfection and find ways to prevent the consequences. Now, as a kid, I never wanted to eat off the kids' menu because I think it was somehow like inferior. Like, why can't I have the adult stuff? It's like better, right? So, I don't remember eating things like chicken nuggets as a kid, and so you really should not listen to a kid who didn't know how to be a kid.
There's a lot of virtue to chicken nuggets. All right, Rob, you wrote a book on the topic, which is called Troubled. I encourage all of our viewers to go out and purchase. You can see it if you're watching on YouTube. You can see it behind Rob. But give our viewers a sense of your article and the book and why you shouldn't listen to kids.
Well, in contrast to John, I still order off the kids' menu. Portion control is important. Summer's coming. Uh, yeah. I mean, the book, very briefly, I trace my, unusual trajectory from being born into poverty in Los Angeles, foster homes in California, fled as soon as I could. I joined the military when I was 17, went off to the Air Force, and then went to Yale on the GI Bill, and then got a PhD at Cambridge. So it was, very indirect, circuitous path to higher education. And, along the way, I learned that there seems to be this, especially once I got to college, this glorification of the youth. Listen to young people, they're always right. And this seems to be a holdover attitude from the sort of baby boomer, late 1960s era, where a lot of the adults, the authority figures who are in charge today, were either participated in or were sympathetic to a lot of those youth-driven movements, 50 years ago. And today they see themselves in a lot of these activists and these young people today, and their reluctance to enforce the authority that they hold. And so in that piece, I go through all these statistics indicating that whether you look at self-reports or actual behavior, young people are, more deceitful, more criminally inclined. As an example, a 20-year-old man is 6 times more likely to be arrested for a violent crime than a 60-year-old man. But there are a bunch of other stats in that piece. And, in my own book, I write about, a lot of the misadventures and unwise decisions that I made and a lot of my friends made when we were growing up in these kind of fragmented, unstable family environments where we'd play chicken on the railroad tracks. Essentially, both of me and my friend, we'd sit in the kind of in the middle of the railroad tracks. The train would approach, and whoever got up first was the loser. The loser in quotes. Um, by the time I was a teenager, a lot of drinking and driving and drug use and everything else. And one thing I try to point out in the book is that, I knew, in terms of knowledge, I understood that a lot of the things I was doing these were unwise, these were foolhardy choices, but I wasn't wise enough to actually act on that knowledge. There's a difference between knowing something is good for you versus acting on it. And I think acting on it, that type of wisdom comes with age, that comes with experience, that comes with, listening to people who are older and who've lived more of life than you. So I try to make that clear in the piece as well.
Fair. All my youthful discussion was apparently setting myself up for getting into podcasting, and it's a mistake I've regretted ever since. On that, that's about all the time that we have. So thank you, as always, to our panelists. Listeners, go buy Rob's book. It's great. Thank you to our producer, Isabella Regi. Listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, and if you haven't, I encourage you to like, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube, other platforms. Leave us questions, comments. We might eventually even read some of them on the air. Really, I promise. Until next time, you've been listening to the Citizen Podcast. I hope you'll join us again soon.